Welcome to Fair and Square. Our guest today is Mr. Navtej Sarna, eminent author, writer and diplomat. Welcome, Mr. Sarna, on Fair and Square. Mr. Sarna, in the morning, I was browsing through your website and it showcases you as this very multifaceted personality, a diplomat, a writer, an author. May I take the liberty of asking you, what's your first love in this various, categories?
Well, I am a diplomat by profession. I very much love it. And writing is something which has started off as a hobby and it still remains a hobby. I don't live by my writing. But I think I'm very fortunate that both these aspects of my life have never contradicted each other. And they've in fact complemented each other all along. So it's difficult to choose.
How do you do the balancing act, as in finding time and...
Yeah, it is a constant balancing act, but as I always believe that if you want to really do something badly enough, you find time within the 24 hours. It's not always possible, it's not always easy.
Right.
But there are patches when you can, when it's more easy to find a balance, and then otherwise one or the other. And it's usually the writing which has to go onto the back burner because you can't stop your profession.
So where do you gain this inspiration from, especially for your writing?
Well, I've always wanted to be a writer of some sort, and I belong to a family of writers. My father was a writer, my mother's a writer, and they were writing in Punjabi, etc. So one grew up in a family of books. And
your father was a very eminent Punjabi writer and a poet.
Right. He was, of course, the first inspiration. And then I just had my own interests that I had to develop myself as a writer.
You've written 7 books. Let me name a few. Folk Tales of Poland, The Book of Nanak, We Weren't Lovers Like That, Winter Evenings. Today you are in Chandigarh, invited by the Chandigarh Literary Society to talk about a book which was written, short stories written by your father, and you've translated them in English. Savage Stories of Partition Harvest, that's the title that you have given. Can you share what this book is all about?
Yeah, this is actually, as you said, my father was a prominent Punjabi writer, and one of the major events which influenced his writing was the partition. He was a personal eyewitness. He was caught up in the cataclysm of partition, as were so many millions of others, and he saw it at a very close range, and that affected his writing deeply. So he wrote a large number of short stories which dealt with the partition. So I picked 30 of these short stories in Savage Harvest and put them as one collection in English, because I thought that we needed to get to these stories to a larger audience. And these are stories essentially which although they describe very horrible events during partition, they are essentially stories of hope, because they focus on the humanity of individuals without any reflection on which community or which religion they belong to,
right,
who showed humanity even when barbarism was happening all around them. So these are stories which essentially showcase this humanity.
So this is the first work you've translated for your father's work?
I had done some of these stories individually earlier, which were published in various magazines, but as a collection, yes, this is the first book that I have done.
Ek the translation, from Persian to English about the Zafarnama that the Guru wrote to Aurangzeb in 1706. It's a highly acclaimed work, of yours. What were the challenges, when you were translating that from Persian? I mean, first, did you learn Persian? And also that, especially, something which is written 3 centuries ago, and in times, how would you capture the Guru's mood, especially the kind of, sacrifice that he had given and the kind of life that he was going through. So how would you go through
it was a very daunting task. It was very challenging. I do have some grounding in Persian, not enough, I must say. So I had to rely on a lot of existing translations. I think the major challenge was to be able to reflect exactly what was meant to be said, and not only in English, but in English rhyme.
Right.
So I tried my best to do that.
This is not prose.
It is not prose. It's in 111 verses.
Right, exactly the same.
Exactly the same verses. I have tried to do in English. It's a monumental document because it is written by Guru Gobind Singh when he has actually, in material terms, he has lost everything. He's out on his own without his followers, without his warriors, without his family. In fact, he's separated from everybody, and still he writes this letter, which is a letter of victory to Aurangzeb. So it was not an easy task, I must say, but I was very fortunate that I managed to complete it.
But how would you, like, just be there? I mean, because one of the job of a translator is just to be just there as what the original writer must have thought.
Well, I think, you have to study the context pretty deeply, and I've tried to reflect that in a long essay which is part of the book so that anybody who's not familiar with the context can also read it first. It shows the historical issues of the time. It shows the philosophical framework within which Guru Gobind Singh was speaking from.
Right.
And so it's not just a letter written as part of a military exchange.
Right, sure.
It is a different spiritual framework spiritual and philosophical framework from which he is speaking.
Mr. I.J. Singh, US-based, Sikh scholar of great repute, he has raised a very important, valid observation of the Zafarnama while mentioning your work, and in which he writes that the challenge is how to derive from the Zafarnama some modern notions of war and peace, and then to connect them to very timely ideas of confronting leaders and governments with the truth. What is your opinion on that?
I think it's very true, because I think the document is relevant today, because it talks of morality in warfare, morality in governance. It talks of the kind of values that leaders must espouse. It talks of how man's relationship with God and his creator, and man's relationship with the world in those terms. And these are forever values. They don't change from century. Well, the context may change. The immediate. Right. But so this was another reason why I felt that that document needed to be brought out in English at this stage. So there are a lot of permanent lessons that are given there,
which are embodied in
which are embodied there.
Right. So out of your experience of translating such a powerful work and as well going through the whole process of it, is pen mightier than the sword?
I think it is. I think, frankly, the pen lasts longer, or the ink lasts longer, and the pen is certainly mightier than the sword, because it's a absolute classic case in the Zafarnama where a person who is sitting with no swords in that sense still can take a stand and tell the other person that, look, you've lost because all you did this is wrong, and you really need help.
Right.
In that sense. So certainly I think in a long-term perspective, as we have seen, what the pen writes is remembered.
So it remains
more
true.
Absolutely, absolutely. So perhaps you could say that the ink is more powerful than blood.
Now I come to one of your other acclaimed work, that is the book, The Exile, which is a novel based on the life of Maharaja Duleep Singh. You've written it through the eyes of Duleep Singh, the various historical events and how he would be thinking and what he would be going through. So, you translated the Zafarnama and perhaps, tried to find out the context of and what the Guru would have gone through. Similarly, you actually must have gone through the same experience with this book, because you were actually judging it through the eyes of Duleep Singh. What was your experience with this?
Well, this is even to a greater extent, because here I did not try to do that in case of Zafarnama, because I was concentrating on a proper translation of a very powerful Persian document. But here I was faced with a historical character, which is who is treated rather shabbily in terms of analysis by historians, and a bit unfairly, because you mostly have British historians writing about him. And I thought when I read about him, I thought it was an eminently human situation which needed to be looked at from the psychological point of view, from the emotional point of view. So I had to really read up what he had written in terms of his letters, the places he had lived in, the feelings that he must have felt, which all human beings feel at certain points of deprivation, deception, being separated from his mother, finding out that he had been cheated, a man who actually changed his religion twice. Such a person must have gone through emotional upheavals of
So you traveled
of
and
a very
visited the
major
places?
I did. I was fortunate enough to visit most of the places which were critical to his life. I visited Lahore, I visited England, his estate in England. I visited Russia, where he lived for a while. I visited Paris, where he stayed in several different places in the latter part of his life. So I did get a lot of first-hand experience of the kind of places he must have lived in, so that helped me fill up the emotional and the psychological blanks in his story,
Right.
Which history doesn't.
So how much fiction is it and how much truth?
Actually, everything that is factually involved in the book is factually true. So
Okay.
I have not created any events, I have not created any dates, I have not changed any places, I have not changed any sequences. What happens, what is created is where there are complete blanks, and you're creating an emotional situation or you're creating a conversation. Even
Right.
these conversations are more or less derived from, inferred from, say, letters.
Right.
And then what I have created is made perhaps what are minor historical characters, made them into major narrators. So I would say, there's very little pure fiction in this. Everything is confined within historical parameters.
Right. You mentioned, the British historians at some point distorting history. There is an account by Sir Lepel Griffin where he, in fact, doubts that Duleep Singh was Maharaja Ranjit Singh's son, and probably he was a water carrier's son. How as a historian, as someone who did research, overcome this fact and corroborated with other facts to establish that Duleep Singh was Maharaja Ranjit Singh's
See, very
son?
often given the materials that we have and the fact of that record keeping was what it was during the early part of the 19th century, and the Indians, our courts kept some records of some things, and some things they completely ignored. So these are questions which very often remain open.
Right.
And I have, I have dealt with this question by raising it at an angle in the book and then letting it be, because the important thing that I've established is that he was one of his acknowledged sons.
Right. Fair.
So once he is his acknowledged son, he becomes one of his heirs.
Right.
Whether he was his biological son or not is a question that people have raised. May or may not be true. I have no way of saying it. But the fact is that Duleep Singh was the youngest acknowledged son of Maharaja Ranjit Singh.
So how much time did it take you to write and complete this book?
But the entire process of that book was 9 years.
Wow.
From the time I actually started reading up about Ranjit Singh's court and whatever was happening at that time to the actual publication of the book was a very long period of 9 years.
Was being a diplomat an added advantage since, you while writing The Exile, since you were dealing with facts, established by a country which was, which had ruled India, So did this whole experience of being a diplomat and seeing the world?
I think it's been a tremendous advantage to be a diplomat. And it's helped my writing a lot. It's enriched my writing. It's given me an opportunity to be in places where I may not have been able to be if I had not been in this profession. It's allowed me access to areas where I happened to be staying in Washington in a diplomatic posting when I started researching the Duleep Singh book. And I had the advantage of being able to go to the Library of Congress, which has a fantastic wealth of books and materials, which are published here, but it's easier to access them there.
But in terms of judgment, judgment, I mean, inferring the same facts which, you know, a normal person or a historian or a writer
Well,
would.
I think anybody with a certain amount of political sensitivity and depth would have inferred this. I don't think being a diplomat adds much more in those terms.
Right.
Of course, because you're trained to read these things, it becomes a little easier, perhaps. But I suppose anybody who's actually taking up this subject would have the normal acumen for doing this.
Like, the Exile throws a lot of history and facts, but at the end of your epilogue, you know, there is a pondering on whether Punjab will be left, you know, with a memory of a Maharaja in exile. How would you personally like, you know, Duleep Singh to be remembered?
He will be remembered as a Maharaja in exile, but I would like him to be remembered in a well-rounded way, in a man, because very often he is reviled. He's reviled as somebody who maybe changed his religion or went away, didn't come back. I think we owe it to ourselves to understand the full, all the aspects of the tragedy of his life. He was clearly a man whose destiny was not in his own hands, and he became more of a plaything of historical circumstances. Right. So I would like him to be remembered with a fuller knowledge about him, which I think I hope to achieve through The Exile, so that people who read that would have a more well-rounded.
You know the site where Duleep Singh is buried
in Elvedon.
In Elvedon, yes. in the church. It's a very, very tragic site, you know, and there is this talk that his body should be exhumed and, you know, the remains brought to Punjab and, you know, cremated in the Sikh tradition. Since he, you know, died as a Sikh, he kind of came back into the Sikh fold. Do you think it's a valid idea?
Well, you know, this is an idea which has been coming and happening and rising and this thing, and there are people who would like this to happen. It's a very complicated idea. It's a complicated process, and but I think what is more important here is that he should be acknowledged for what he was, you know, and certainly I think there is this feeling when you go to that place that, you know, you get a very strange, sad feeling.
In fact, it's expressed in your this thing, the book also. So why don't you read a paragraph?
Well, I think what perhaps it's mentioned in a few places, but perhaps what I would write is when in this paragraph when Mangla, who was the slave girl of Rani Jinda, meets Arur Singh, who was Dileep's valet, and Dileep comes, and this is a fictional meeting, that he comes and tells Mangla that Dileep Singh has died. So Mangla says, "But you tell me now, Arur, that Dileep has gone to his God and you have buried him in Vilayat? Buried him in the land of the Firangi? May you all perish in hell. We needed to bathe him and dress him like a king and cremate him, burn him on a pyre of sandalwood, then pray for mercy on his soul. He suffered all his life. Even in death he will not find peace. He will wait forever to be one with the dust of his Punjab."
Excellent. You know, also you talk about the kohinoor, the diamond, and how it was forcibly taken by the British from Duleep Singh. You know, I mean, maybe as a diplomat, you know, what do you think, what do you make out of the demand, you know, by India to bring it back? Is it a valid demand again?
You know, it's very difficult for me, both as a diplomat and as a writer, to comment on this, because I think these are very complicated issues of historicity, politics, and relations between two countries. So, particularly given my professional aspects, I'd rather not go there on camera.
But if I were also to ask you that Pakistan also stakes a claim, since it was the Lahore Darbar, you know, so whose claim is more?
See, that's another area where I'm not going to go to at all.
And you've also written about Nanak, you know, and then the Zafarnama, I'm referring to it again, and then Duleep Singh. It's basically as if you're picking up biographical characters, you know, from the Sikh religion as well as the Sikh history. What drives you to pick up characters? Is it empathy or is it
I think it's certainly empathy. It's certainly a desire to understand one's own roots, one's own history, one's own upbringing, if you like. It's because I think you cannot understand anything else if you can't understand yourself.
But how do you pick up, these characters? Is it why this and why not the other? It's just...
Well, it has to be something which speaks to you.
Right.
It speaks to you. I mean, for instance, the lip sync story is a haunting story, and it haunted me since childhood. I used to hear it in childhood, and I used to get goose flesh about, what is this strange character, where did he go, and what happened to him. And, so there are, it has to, for something for you to live with it for 9 years, it has to be haunting you.
Do you think more Sikh writers are interested in such topics?
I should hope so. I should hope
or
so.
You're the lone one at the moment?
Well, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are people doing lots of work out there, because it is a very rich history, and it's a history full of characters and full of events, and it's probably not been mined enough.
I mean, as part of your work, obviously you must be getting some criticism. And so how do you handle your criticism, if you ever got?
Well, so far, people have been kind, mostly. And I think once you step out and leave your work to the world, there's that amount of risk that you have to take.
Something about your diplomatic career in terms of, when you joined, and some interesting assignments. I mean, we all remember you as the spokesperson for the External Affairs Ministry, and in our conscious, it is, I mean, this image of yours is there. But yeah, something about your diplomatic
Well, I've had a
career.
very, very exciting career, and I'm still in the service. So it's been absolutely wonderful so far, not a day of regret. I joined in 1980. And I've been very fortunate to be posted to some absolutely very interesting capitals of Russia, in Soviet Union, the old-time Soviet Union, in Poland, in the United States, in Iran, Geneva, Bhutan, and then finally in Israel was my last posting. So it's been a fascinating journey so far, and I hope it carries on the same way.
Best of luck with that. But as someone who has served in the USA, Sikh heritage has gained a lot in America. Why is it that it has gained there, and in India it's still very, very, there's no movement? What are the reasons?
I'm not sure what is implied here, but I think,
it has gained a following, in the sense that people are more sensitive towards it.
Right,
people
right.
Want to talk about it. People want to preserve it.
Well, I think here also, perhaps here we don't feel the impulse so much, as because we feel this is anyway here, and so we are home here. So you don't, maybe when you're outside, you feel a greater need to propagate it and to defend it, and that's always natural. But I don't see any problems here either. I mean, there's always a need, and here it's particularly important, I think, to point this out, that there is always a need for every history, every community to be looking inwards, to researching, to projecting, and that only it's our duty for the next generations.
You were the Indian ambassador to Israel for 3 years or
about 4 years.
For about 4 years. So how has your Sikh upbringing, and your interfaith credentials, as well as your own experiences of partition, which you mentioned, has helped you to understand the Israel-Palestinian issue?
I would say that these are the kind of issues which anybody who is politically sensitive, culturally sensitive, would understands and handles as part of our diplomatic profession. But certainly, I would say that as somebody who has read about partition, who has read about intra-religious issues, rival claims, I think all this certainly helped me to understand the very, very complicated situation that exists. And I think it's important but I think Indians have a tremendous advantage, all Indians, I think, because we all come from this country in which you have this multiple faiths living together. You have this tremendous coexistence and centuries of coexistence.
Right.
And all this certainly is a tremendous added value to your credentials that you bring to any situation.
Are you writing something else now from your experiences
Yes, I've written something else now, which is in the pipeline actually, and that's not a political book, but it's going to be a historical, personalized historical narrative about the Indian connection to Jerusalem.
Oh.
So this is something which I think has not been talked about or written about much, but I've tried to do that through a personalized travel narrative, and this is a book which it's in the making. Well, it's in the,
I'm going to ask you a question regarding your diplomatic this thing. There's this turban issue.
I probably end up not answering it.
Okay, you're prerogative entirely. This turban issue is raising its head again and again. A, about the airport security, and B, this ban, in France, and now a certain province of Belgium has also, forced a ban. Where do we stand? What is your opinion? I mean, have we kind of taken it up well at a diplomatic level?
I think that's what you mentioned is a question, but I think you would have to invite me again as if I ever become the Foreign Office spokesperson again. So to give you an official answer or an answer. But here, this is something which, because it involves relations with other countries, and given my constraints as a diplomat.
But you've been a victim of racial profiling yourself.
Well, when you're abroad, all these things happen. But I think the important thing is to distinguish myself when I'm in a diplomatic role and when I'm as a writer. So today I'm here as a writer, so I'm going to apologize to your audience and not answer it.
Fair enough. Okay, my one last question to you. Historical blunder in the narrative or a diplomatic blunder? Which one would you go with?
Which one should I? Well, I just hope I make neither.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Sarna, for being on the show.
Pleasure being
here. Such a lovely, having you here.
Thank you so
ਖਬਰਾਂ ਦੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਓ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਕਦੇ ਵੀ ਤੇ ਕਿਤੋਂ ਵੀ ਜੁੜੋ ਆਪਾਂ ਮਿਲਾਂਗੇ ਫੇਸਬੁੱਕ ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਦਿਖਾਂਗੇ YouTube ਤੇ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਫੋਲੋ ਕਰੋ ਟਵਿੱਟਰ ਤੇ ਖਬਰਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜੇ ਰਹੋ ਦਿਨ ਰਾਤ